The day he called me an example of wasted potential, 31 students heard it. I know the number because I counted them afterward. I stood in the back of that classroom with chalk dust on my jeans and a failing exam paper in my hand, and I counted every face that turned to look at me. Some of them smirked. Most looked away. One girl, Vanessa, who sat by the window and always finished her tests first, kept her eyes forward, which I somehow found worse than the smirking. His name was Mr. Keller. He said it without raising his voice, which is the worst way to humiliate someone. He just laid the statement down on the room like a verdict. Adams, you're becoming an example of wasted potential in this class. And honestly, you're becoming an example for everyone in this room of what happens when a person stops caring. I hadn't stopped caring. I had worked the night shift at a Hollenbeck industrial warehouse from 11 p.m. to 5:30 a.m. I had gotten home at 6, checked on my grandfather's oxygen levels, made sure his medication was laid out correctly, changed the dressing on his left leg because his circulation was failing, and then changed into school clothes and walked 14 minutes to the bus stop. I had been awake for approximately 22 consecutive hours when I sat down in that classroom, but I didn't say any of that, because at 17, you don't yet know how to say it. You just absorb it. I keep that moment somewhere specific inside myself. Not buried, not healed over, just filed. The way you keep a document you know you'll need later. 14 years later, I would be the person deciding whether Richard Keller's school continued to exist. I want to be precise about that. I'm not telling this story because it has a satisfying ending. I'm telling it because it has a true one, and those are different things. By the time I sat across from him in my office, him in a visitor's chair, me behind a desk he would have considered extravagant. Nuance, I had spent enough years inside institutional systems to understand that what he did to me was not a personal cruelty, it was a policy. And policies, unlike personal grudges, can be dismantled correctly. I dismantled it correctly. My grandfather's name was Marcus Adams. He was 68 when I moved in with him, and he had the specific kind of stubbornness that comes from surviving things that should have broken you. He'd worked 30 years in municipal maintenance, raised my mother mostly alone after her mother left, and then raised me after my mother's situation became what it became. He never complained about any of it. He didn't have the vocabulary for complaint. What he had was routine, and routine was how he showed love. Every morning before school, he made 2 fried eggs and put them on a plate with toast cut diagonally. Every Sunday, he watched a nature documentary and fell asleep in his recliner before the second segment. Every evening, he asked me the same question, "You learn anything useful today?" When I was 15, he started getting winded walking to the mailbox. By 16, he'd been diagnosed with congestive heart failure, complicated by late-stage peripheral arterial disease. The medication list was 4 drugs long. The costs were not manageable on his fixed income. There was no other family, there was just us. So I got the warehouse job. A guy named Steven who lived 2 blocks over had worked there for years and knew the floor supervisor. The work was physically straightforward, receiving pallets, logging inventory, moving product. The hours were brutal, but the math was clear. I needed a certain number of dollars per month to keep his prescriptions filled. The warehouse provided those dollars, everything else was secondary. School became something I attended the way you attend a function you're obligated to be present at. I was there physically. Mentally, I was running calculations. Medication costs against warehouse hours against upcoming bills, even during lectures. I wasn't disengaged from education. I was genuinely interested in history, in how systems developed, in how decisions made in one era cascaded into consequences for people who hadn't been born yet. What I was disengaged from was the performance of being a student, the careful management of appearances that gets you noticed in the right ways. Mr. Keller taught AP United States history. He was 43, well-dressed in the way of men who equate appearance with character, and he had the classroom presence of someone who had decided early that his real job was not teaching but sorting, separating the promising from the unpromising. He was good at the mechanics of teaching. His lectures were organized. His assessments were thoughtful. But underneath all of it ran this current of categorical judgment that he seemed utterly unaware of, or perhaps entirely comfortable with. He had decided within the first month of school that I was unpromising. I could feel it in how he called on me, with a slightly amused skepticism, as if he were giving me a chance to confirm his assessment. I could see it in how he returned my papers. When I turned in a 15-page extra credit essay on the constitutional implications of the post-Reconstruction amendments, he gave it a perfunctory comment and moved on. When Brandon Foster, whose father was on the school's booster committee, turned in 7 pages on the same general topic, Keller spent 4 minutes praising his insight. I noticed this. I cataloged it. I didn't know what to do with it yet. The exam that broke things was a midterm on the progressive era. I had been awake 38 hours when I took it. My grandfather had had a crisis the night before, not a full emergency, but close enough that I'd sat with him until nearly 4 a.m., monitoring his oxygen saturation, then worked a partial shift, then come directly to school. I remember sitting down in the testing room and feeling the room tilt slightly, which is what happens to your vision when you've been awake that long. I failed it. Not catastrophically, I got a 61, but enough to drop my grade from a B to something that would permanently affect my overall average. I went to Keller the following Monday and asked about a retake. Retakes aren't standard policy, he said, not looking up from his desk. I know. I'm asking for an exception. I had a medical situation with my family that night. He looked up then. The look was one I'd seen before, the measuring look, the sorting look. If I gave exceptions to everyone with a difficult home situation, the assessment would be meaningless. I'm not asking for everyone. I'm asking for me. The answer is no, he paused. You should think about whether this class is the right level for you. I left his office and stood in the hallway for a moment, trying to determine what I felt. What I felt was something very cold settling into my chest. Not rage. Rage is hot. This was something that had no temperature at all. The public humiliation came 3 weeks later, when he returned a subsequent quiz and made his comment about wasted potential in front of the class. By that point, I had already recalculated. I knew the failed midterm had likely ended my chances at the grade I needed for the district academic merit grant. I hadn't yet confirmed it. I think I was protecting myself from confirming it. The grant was $4,000, renewable annually. It would have covered approximately 7 months of my grandfather's primary medications. When the awards were announced and my name wasn't on them, I went to the guidance office and requested the committee's feedback. The feedback was that my grades were insufficient and that a faculty recommendation had raised concerns about my academic reliability. I asked which faculty member. They wouldn't tell me directly. But there was only one teacher whose opinion of me I had directly contested. I went home that evening and made my grandfather's dinner and sat with him while he watched his nature documentary. He fell asleep before the second segment the way he always did. I sat beside him in the dark for a long time. I didn't cry. I hadn't cried in probably 2 years by that point. What I did was make a decision, quiet and complete, that settled into me the way decisions do when you've stopped having the energy to be dramatic about your own life. I was going to understand the system, not just endure it, understand it well enough to do something with it. My grandfather died 6 months before I graduated high school. Congestive heart failure, a Tuesday morning in November. At home, in his recliner with a nature documentary on the television, he could no longer really see clearly. I found him when I came home from the warehouse. The paramedics said he had gone quietly. I graduated in the spring with a 3.4 GPA, which was lower than it should have been. I had gotten a small Pell Grant and a community college scholarship. I enrolled in community college that fall and worked 2 jobs, a daytime clerical position at a district administrative office and weekend shifts at a copy shop. I want to describe that period accurately because it's important not to make it sound noble. It was not noble. It was exhausting and frequently humiliating and full of small daily defeats. I was 20 years old, living in a studio apartment that smelled like the previous tenant's cigarettes, eating sandwiches I made at home because restaurants were not in my financial reality, falling asleep over textbooks with the specific kind of tired that goes deeper than physical fatigue into something structural, into the bones. But the clerical job was instructive. I was working in the district's administrative support office, which meant I was adjacent to the actual machinery of how a school system operated. I was filing documents and scheduling meetings and occasionally being asked to organize correspondence. None of it was consequential work, but it let me observe how consequential decisions were made, which forms went to where, which departments had actual authority, which had the illusion of it, how compliance requirements worked, what a formal review process looked like when it was functioning and when it was not. I started taking notes. Not in any calculated way at first. I found the architecture of institutional decision-making genuinely interesting. How rules were constructed, how they could be applied consistently or selectively, how documentation created permanent record, while verbal agreements evaporated. I started to see the district not as a monolith, but as a layered system with points of entry, points of leverage, and points of vulnerability. My community college professors were, without exception, more invested in my success than any teacher I'd had at the high school. One of them, a woman who taught policy analysis and had the precise, merciless intelligence of someone who has spent decades watching systems fail people, wrote me a recommendation letter that got me a transfer scholarship to a state university. She told me directly what Keller had never considered telling me, that I was capable of genuinely rigorous work, that my situational analysis was sophisticated, and that the analytical skills I had developed, surviving difficult circumstances, could be redirected into a professional capacity that would carry weight. I held that letter for a long time after she gave it to me. Not sentimentally, strategically. It was data. It told me something measurable about the gap between how Keller had assessed me and what was actually true. At university, I studied public policy and education administration. I was methodical about it. I took every course I could find on institutional accountability, accreditation processes, state oversight mechanisms, and educational equity law. I worked mornings at the university, library, and evenings at a tutoring center. I graduated in 4 years with a 3.89 GPA. I attended the ceremony alone because there was no one to invite. Graduate school followed on a partial fellowship. I covered the remainder with a combination of research assistantships and, for one particularly difficult semester, a second job delivering food on weekends. I was completing a master's thesis on disparate outcomes in faculty recommendation practices, specifically how subjective recommendation letters functioned to reproduce socioeconomic stratification across American secondary and post-secondary education. When I made my first major strategic mistake, I had been introduced through my advisor to a small nonprofit focused on educational advocacy. They were doing interesting work on recommendation bias, and I was briefly invited to present my preliminary research at one of their forums. The director, a man named Gregory Lawson, who had considerable charisma and a talent for making his organizational interests sound like your personal mission, invited me to join the organization full-time after graduation. I was 26, recently graduated, and deeply interested in the work. I took the position. It was a mistake. Not because the work was meaningless, some of it was genuinely good, but because Lawson was operating the organization as a profile-building exercise rather than a change-making institution. Every report we produced was optimized for press coverage rather than actionable policy impact. Every coalition we joined was evaluated for visibility rather than effectiveness. He had a talent for positioning the organization at the center of conversations without ever pushing those conversations to conclusions. Results were not the point. The appearance of results was the point. I spent 18 months realizing this incrementally, the way you come to understand an uncomfortable truth about a place you've invested yourself in. By month 12, I was running the organization's primary research division and producing work that, while excellent, was being used primarily to generate grant applications rather than drive actual institutional change. By month 15, I had understood Lawson's entire operating model. By month 18, I submitted my resignation. The period afterward was genuinely difficult. I was 28 years old. I had walked away from a position that looked good on paper, and I had no immediate prospects. I moved to a cheaper apartment. I took on freelance policy consulting work that paid irregularly. For approximately 4 months, I was in a financial situation that I would describe as managed precarity. Not crisis, but close enough to crisis that I could feel it. I did 2 things during that period that would matter later. First, I completed a substantial independent research project on state-level accreditation review processes that I published in an education policy journal. The paper attracted modest attention in academic circles, but meaningful attention from a state education department official who reached out to compliment my methodology. Second, I began studying systematically how state funding mechanisms for private schools operated. Not because I had any specific target in mind, because I understood by then that knowledge of systems was the only real form of leverage that couldn't be taken away. The call from the state education department came 4 months after my resignation from Lawson's organization. It was an entry-level policy analyst position, not glamorous, but inside the actual machinery I had spent years observing from the outside. I took it. The next 5 years were not dramatic. I want to be honest about that because narratives like this tend to skip the unglamorous accumulation and go straight to the transformation. And the skipping is a lie. Real leverage is built through boring, incremental competence. I was a thorough analyst. I documented everything. I developed a reputation for reviews that were unusually rigorous and absolutely legally defensible, which meant that when my findings were challenged, they withstood scrutiny. I was promoted twice in 3 years, first to senior analyst, then to lead reviewer. I developed relationships with oversight board members, legal compliance staff, and institutional administrators that were professional, precise, and built on a track record of correct assessments. During this period, I had one relationship with a woman named Danielle, who was completing her legal residency and had approximately the same relationship with downtime that I had, which is to say, neither of us really had one. We were together for 2 years. We were genuinely good for each other in many ways. We ended it mutually when her residency concluded, and she accepted a position in another state. We were adults about it. I think about her occasionally, with warmth and without regret, which is probably the cleanest ending any relationship can have. I also, during this period, began setting aside money systematically for what I thought of internally as the foundation. I did not yet know exactly what form it would take. I knew it would involve supporting students facing the kind of circumstances I had faced. I treated it as a savings target the same way I treated everything else, as a math problem with a solvable answer. By year 5, I had been promoted to Senior Director of Academic Oversight. I was 33 years old. I had direct authority over funding reviews, accreditation assessments, and corrective action recommendations for 47 private institutions across the state. I did not use that authority carelessly. I used it the way I used everything, methodically, documentably, within legal parameters that made every decision bulletproof. I should explain what that authority actually meant in practice. When a private school received state subsidies, and many of them depended heavily on those subsidies, they were subject to periodic oversight reviews. My office conducted those reviews. If we found compliance issues, we could recommend funding holds, corrective action plans, or, in serious cases, referral to the Oversight Board for accreditation suspension. These recommendations were not final. They went through a review board, but my office's findings carried significant weight because we had built a consistent record of rigorous, defensible analysis. I was not a person who made decisions emotionally. I had learned, over years of careful work inside institutional systems, that emotion in this context was a liability. Every decision I made had to be justified on documented grounds. This was not suppression, this was discipline, which is a different thing. Suppression means not feeling something. Discipline means not letting what you feel determine what you do. I felt things. I had been feeling things for a long time. I just knew exactly where to file them. Richard Keller's name appeared in my professional orbit without any action on my part. That's important because it's the kind of detail people don't believe, but it's the only version that's true. Our office received a routine flagging from the state subsidy allocation system. A private academy, Westfield Preparatory Academy, had submitted an application for expedited funding approval. The school was requesting acceleration of their annual subsidy review due to, as their submission stated, significant institutional financial pressures that required timely resolution. The name of the school's principal was listed in the submission documents as Richard T. Keller. I read the name twice. I set the document down. I looked at the wall of my office, which is a neutral gray that I find useful for thinking. I want to be completely precise about what happened inside me in that moment. There was recognition. There was a very specific, very old sensation that I can only describe as the memory of cold, that thing that had settled into my chest the afternoon he denied my retake request. And then there was something that clicked into place, not excitement, not anticipation, something more like the sensation of a calculation resolving. I put the file in the normal intake queue. I did not expedite it. I did not delay it. I assigned it to myself, which was within my normal practice for cases involving expedited requests, as those required senior review. Then I began to read. Westfield Preparatory Academy had been established 26 years earlier as a college prep institution serving a mixed-income district. Over the years, it had gradually shifted its student composition. The current enrollment skewed heavily toward families in the upper income brackets, though the school maintained enough lower-income enrollment to qualify for various state support programs that provided substantial annual funding. Its financial situation was genuinely difficult. Private donations had declined over the previous 3 years. A building renovation had gone significantly over budget. 2 major donor families had pulled their commitments following unrelated personal circumstances. The school now relied on state subsidies for approximately 31% of its operating budget. Without timely renewal of that funding at current levels, it would face choices between staff reductions, program cuts, or significant tuition increases. The expedited request was not unusual in form. Schools in financial distress requested acceleration regularly. The question was always whether acceleration was appropriate given the school's compliance record. I ordered the full compliance history. This is standard. What was not standard was how thoroughly I intended to read it. Our standard review process covered the previous 3 years of compliance documentation. I requested 7 years. I explained the request to my team as due diligence given the school's stated financial fragility, which was accurate. I did not mention the other reason. There was only one person in my office who needed to know the full scope of my interest in this review, and that person was me. My lead analyst was a precise, efficient woman named Jasmine, who had worked in oversight for 6 years and had the specific ability to find patterns in documentation that most reviewers would read past. I assigned her to lead the factual compilation. I did not tell her what I was looking for. I told her I wanted a complete picture of student outcome patterns relative to demographic indicators over the 7-year period. I told her to flag any discontinuities in recommendation practices or grade adjustments relative to the standardized assessment data. She came back to me in 11 days with findings that were more systematic than I had anticipated. The pattern was not subtle once you knew to look for it. Westfield Preparatory Academy had, over a 7-year period, maintained a student body that was approximately 22% classified as lower income based on their own intake documentation. These students received standard tuition support and were included in enrollment figures that the school submitted to qualify for various equity-based state programs. But the academic outcome data told a different story. When Jasmine cross-referenced faculty recommendations, grade adjustments, and advanced placement access against income classification, the results were systematic. Lower-income students received faculty evaluations that were consistently lower than their standardized assessment scores would predict, were recommended for honors and AP coursework at significantly lower rates than their higher-income peers with comparable testing performance, and were rated in subjective categories like academic initiative and institutional fit in ways that diverged dramatically from objective performance indicators. More specifically, the school had developed a practice of maintaining what their internal documentation called a calibrated performance matrix, a faculty-facing framework that, when analyzed for what it actually measured, functioned as a mechanism for systematically reducing the academic records of lower-income students while elevating those of students from donor families. The calibration was not explicit in the documents. It didn't have to be. The pattern in the data was clear enough. The rationale, as best we could reconstruct it from internal communications obtained through our document request, was institutional. The school's performance metrics for college placement depended on maintaining a high rate of successful placements. Selectively limiting which students were tracked toward competitive institutions, and limiting this by income rather than ability, produced cleaner metrics. Those metrics supported donor confidence. Donor confidence supported financial stability. In other words, the school was using disadvantaged students to qualify for equity funding while simultaneously limiting those students' outcomes to protect the school's statistics for its donor base. Richard Keller had been principal for 9 years. The calibrated performance matrix had been formally implemented 7 years ago. In the internal documents, his name appeared as having approved the framework. I sat with this for 24 hours before writing a word of my recommendation. I want to be transparent about what I was feeling during that time, because this is the part I have thought about most carefully in the years since. I was not experiencing clean, uncomplicated satisfaction. What I was experiencing was more complicated, a kind of weight, not guilt, but the weight of understanding that what I was looking at was not only, or even primarily, about Richard Keller and what he had done to me. It was about every student whose record had been quietly diminished in the service of that institution's self-preservation, every kid who'd been told, through the careful mechanism of a lower-than-deserved evaluation, that they were less capable than they were. He hadn't invented that cruelty. He'd just institutionalized it. And then, underneath that understanding, there was something else, something that had been waiting for 14 years, patient and precise and completely certain of itself. I wrote the preliminary recommendation. I received a call the week before the recommendation went to the oversight board. My assistant told me there was a Richard Keller on the line, requesting a direct conversation with me about the Westfield Preparatory Review. I told her to give him a 15-minute slot the following afternoon. He arrived on time, which surprised me slightly. He had aged in the predictable ways. Heavier, hair thinner and grayer. The look of a man who had worn authority long enough that losing it would be a structural crisis rather than just a professional setback. He was dressed well. He had the body language of a man who expected to be listened to. I was standing when he entered, which meant the physical dynamic was not what he'd anticipated. I gestured to the visitor's chair across from my desk. I sat. The desk between us was larger than the desk he would have sat behind as principal. I noted this without commentary. "Mr. Adams," he said, "I appreciate you making time." "Of course," I said. "What can I do for you?" He paused, studying my face. I kept my expression neutral and attentive. The professional face I'd spent years developing, the one that gave nothing away without appearing to conceal anything. "I'm not sure if you remember me, Crow," he said carefully. "I remember you." Something shifted in his face at that. He had been testing the water, and my answer had told him something he wasn't certain he wanted to know. He recalibrated. "Then you understand that our history gives this situation some additional context," he said. "I was hoping we could discuss the review in a way that acknowledges that context." "The review is proceeding according to standard protocol," I said. Of course. He folded his hands on the desk, the gesture of a man trying to appear relaxed. "I think what I'm hoping is that given the relationship—" "We don't have a relationship," I said, not unkindly. "We have a history. Those are different." He was quiet for a moment. "You were one of my students." "Yes. I may not have handled everything perfectly back then. Teachers make mistakes. The capacity to make mistakes is part of—" "Mr. Keller," I said, "I want to be clear about something. This review is based entirely on documented compliance findings. If there are findings of concern, they'll go to the oversight board, because that's the process. If there are no findings of concern, the funding will proceed. My personal history has no place in that process." He looked at me for a long moment. Something was working behind his eyes. "You wanted to raise about the review? You wanted to raise about the review documentation itself? If you have compliance information your team hasn't submitted, this is the appropriate time." He didn't. He thanked me for my time, shook my hand and left. I sat at my desk after he was gone and didn't move for several minutes. I wasn't processing emotion. I was just still. The way things are still when they finally stop moving. The recommendation went to the oversight board 3 weeks later. 47 pages. Jasmine's data analysis, the compliance timeline, the cross-referenced outcome patterns, the documented approval of the calibrated performance matrix, the gap between equity program qualification criteria and actual student outcome practices, every finding documented with source citations, every citation cross-referenced with primary documentation, every conclusion supported by data that would survive any legal challenge. I had been careful. I had been meticulous. I had made absolutely certain that every word in that 47 pages was correct, complete, and legally bulletproof. Not because I was afraid of being wrong, because I understood that the findings had to stand on their own. The moment my personal history entered the picture, even as subtext, even as implication, the entire structure became contaminated. The students those findings were meant to protect deserved better than a case that could be dismissed as personal grievance. The board reviewed the findings over 3 weeks. They brought in independent legal counsel to assess the compliance implications. They requested additional documentation from the school. They received it. It was consistent with our findings. The funding hold was issued 6 weeks after the submission. The language was formal and complete, pending corrective. Action on documented practices related to equitable academic outcome reporting and faculty evaluation frameworks. State subsidy disbursements to Westfield Preparatory Academy were suspended. An internal review was required to be completed within 90 days. The findings were to be addressed in a corrective action plan, approved by the board before any funding reinstatement would be considered. The Academy's board of directors convened an emergency meeting. They brought in outside legal representation. They hired an independent consultant to review the findings. The consultant confirmed them. 3 weeks after the funding hold was issued, Richard Keller submitted his resignation as principal, citing personal health reasons. The Academy's board accepted it without public comment. The school's statement thanked him for his service. I read the statement at my desk with my morning coffee. I didn't feel what I expected to feel. I felt something quieter, something that wasn't satisfaction, exactly. More like the sensation of a weight that has been in the same place for so long you've stopped noticing it, shifting and settling somewhere different, not gone, just repositioned. He called my office 2 weeks after the resignation. My assistant told me Richard Keller was requesting a brief meeting. I gave him 20 minutes on a Thursday afternoon. He came alone. He was not wearing a tie this time. He looked like a man who had recently discovered that his professional persona was a costume, and he wasn't sure what he looked like without it. He sat in the visitor's chair with a different quality of stillness, not the managed stillness of our first meeting, but the stillness of someone who has stopped trying to manage. "I want to ask you something directly," he said, without preamble. "All right." Was this personal? I looked at him for a moment. Behind him, through my office window, the late afternoon light was doing something with the buildings across the street that made everything look briefly like a photograph of itself. "It was procedural," I said. "You taught me that consequences are part of the system." He looked at me for a long moment. I watched him process it. The words, the reference, whether I was confirming what he suspected. I gave him nothing further. He nodded once, slowly. "I see," he said. He stood. He didn't offer his hand this time. He walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. "For what it's worth," he said, without turning around, "I did think you had potential." I didn't respond. He left. I sat at my desk for a very long time afterward, doing nothing at all. Outside my window, the afternoon light moved through the buildings, and then the buildings went dark one by one as the day ended. I thought about my grandfather in his recliner. I thought about a 17-year-old standing in a hallway with a specific cold thing settled in his chest. I thought about 14 years of accumulated, methodical, completely legal consequence building. I thought about whether any of it had made that cold thing move. It hadn't moved. That was the truth of it. I had built something significant, a real body of work, real institutional change, real leverage, and the cold thing was still there, not larger, not controlling anything, but there. I had expected that defeating him would resolve it. I had been wrong about that. The resolution, if there was one, was not going to come from his consequence. It was going to have to come from somewhere else. I had been planning the foundation for 3 years by the time Keller resigned. It had started as a savings target and evolved through careful planning into something with actual legal structure, a nonprofit framework that I had developed with pro bono legal assistance from a friend from graduate school, a tax attorney named Cameron Brooks, who had become one of the few people I considered genuinely close. He had helped me structure it correctly, warned me about every operational pitfall, and ultimately served as its first board member. The formal establishment took 6 months of regulatory work after Keller's resignation. I used that 6 months well. I developed the program framework, created the application and review criteria, built relationships with partner organizations in legal advocacy and academic counseling, and worked with a small communications firm to develop the public-facing material. The foundation launched on a Thursday in early spring. There was no ceremony. There was a press release and a website. The website included, on the About page, A brief statement of origin. The statement read as follows. This foundation was established in memory of Marcus Adams, who raised his grandson on fixed income and unwavering principle, and who believed that a person's circumstances should not determine their ceiling. The Adams Foundation provides emergency academic grants, institutional advocacy, and flexible academic support to students facing severe family hardship, because no student should have to choose between survival and opportunity. I had written that paragraph 11 times before I got it right. The 12th version was the one I kept. The Foundation's first grant cycle received 43 applications. 14 were approved. Each recipient received emergency financial support, assigned academic advocacy resources, and access to a legal review process for any institutional decisions, grade disputes, recommendation challenges, dismissal hearings that might otherwise be navigated alone. I reviewed every application personally. I reviewed every approval decision personally. I did not delegate the initial review to staff, though I would later as the volume grew. That first cycle, I sat with every application myself, reading them at my desk in the evenings, and what I felt reading them was not satisfaction. It was something older and more serious, a kind of recognition. This student working 3 jobs and missing deadlines. This student sleeping in the school library because home was not safe. This student with a sick parent whose teachers had decided that exhaustion was irresponsibility. I recognized all of them. I should say something about what I became over those years, because this is the part that the narrative tends to skip, and the skipping is its own form of lie. I became very good at my work. I became respected in my field. I built real institutional relationships and real professional credibility. I accumulated enough financial stability that the anxiety I'd carried since I was 16, that constant background calculation of costs against resources, finally receded to something manageable. I also became, in ways I am still in the process of understanding, not entirely easy to be close to. Not cold, I don't think that's accurate, but defended in ways that had been adaptive for so long that I'd stopped distinguishing between necessary protection and unnecessary distance. I had gotten very good at strategic relationships, professional friendships that were warm and real, but operated within limits I'd quietly established. The few people who knew me well enough to notice this had, at various points, named it. Cameron had said it once, directly, in the way that people who have earned the right say difficult things. He said, "You've built a lot of things. I'm not sure you've let anyone in while you were building them." I hadn't argued. I'd thought about it for weeks. I was still thinking about it. There is a particular hazard that no one names when they talk about what it cost to survive the way I survived, and then to build the way I built. The hazard is this: the skills that keep you alive when you have nothing, the vigilance, the calculation, the self-sufficiency, the careful management of dependency, those same skills, applied without modification to the rest of your life, create a certain kind of isolation that you can go years without recognizing as isolation, because it doesn't feel like loneliness. It feels like control. I was working on the distinction. I'm not sure I had resolved it. The Foundation's second year saw 61 applications. The third year, 98. Word spread through student advocacy networks, through school counselors, through social media posts from early recipients who had graduated and wanted to point others toward something that had helped them. By year 4, we had a small full-time staff, a formal partnership with 3 university legal clinics, and a review board that included educators, attorneys, and former recipients. I remained the executive director in addition to my position at the State Oversight Office. The dual role was demanding. I worked long hours. I kept my apartment spare and quiet. I ran 4 mornings a week along the same route, which had become its own kind of practice. The regularity of it, the predictable rhythm. I thought about my grandfather frequently, not with grief exactly. Grief has a specific shape that fades, and his shape in my memory had become something else, something more like a presence I carried rather than an absence I mourned. I thought about his question, "You learn anything useful today?" I had, in fact, learned a great deal. I was not certain all of it was the kind of useful he'd had in mind. He had been a gentleman. I had become something more precise. One afternoon in the 4th year, I received a letter. Physical mail, handwritten on plain white paper, forwarded through the Foundation's administrative address. I won't reproduce it exactly. What it said was that the writer had been a student at Westfield Preparatory Academy during the years covered by our oversight investigation, that they had received lowered evaluations they had spent years blaming on their own performance, that when the investigation's findings had become public, through the Oversight Board's published summary, which was a matter of public record, the writer had, for the first time, understood what had actually happened to them. The letter said, "I spent 4 years believing I wasn't as capable as the testing showed. Now I'm finishing my graduate degree. I just wanted someone to know the audit mattered. There was no return address." The writer hadn't signed their name. I kept the letter in the top drawer of my desk. Not filed, not processed, just kept. The Oversight Board's corrective action process with Westfield Preparatory Academy concluded in its 15th month. The school had undergone significant internal changes, new faculty evaluation frameworks, revised recommendation policies, independent auditing of outcome practices. The corrective action plan was approved. Funding was reinstated at a modified level, with ongoing compliance monitoring. The school was still functioning. Some of the students who had been systematically underserved were still enrolled. The new administration had, from all documented indicators, genuinely restructured the problematic practices. This was the correct outcome. This was what the process was designed to produce. I had not wanted the school to fail. I want to be clear about that. What I had wanted, what I had worked toward, was the systematic practice of diminishing disadvantaged students to be made visible, documented, and stopped. That had happened. The institution had been corrected. The students currently enrolled had better protection than they'd had before. This is the distinction between institutional accountability and personal revenge. Revenge wants the antagonist to suffer. Institutional accountability wants the system to function correctly. They can produce some of the same outcomes. Keller had lost his position, which was both an institutional consequence and a personal one. But the mechanism is different. And the mechanism matters, because revenge corrupts the process in ways that undermine the outcome. A case built on personal grievance is a case that can be dismantled on those grounds. A case built on documented systemic harm is a case that stands. I had built it to stand. I am 37 years old. The foundation is in its 4th year. I have retained my position at the Oversight Office, where I am now managing a team of 11 analysts, and have expanded our review capacity across several additional categories of institutional compliance. I am, by any reasonable metric, professionally successful. I live in an apartment I own. I run 4 mornings a week. I read a great deal. I see Cameron and his family for dinner most weeks, which is the closest thing I have to a domestic life. His kids call me uncle, which I find quietly and unexpectedly meaningful. I have been working with a therapist for 2 years. This is not a conclusion I would have come to on my own. Cameron suggested it, and I resisted for nearly 6 months before accepting that my resistance was exactly the kind of thing I should probably talk to someone about. The work is difficult in the way that any serious work is difficult. I am learning to identify the difference between vigilance that is still necessary and vigilance that has become automatic. This is harder than it sounds. I think about the moment I read Keller's name in that intake document and the click that happened somewhere inside me. I have analyzed that moment many times. I think what clicked was not anticipation of revenge. I think what clicked was the recognition that I was, at last, in a position to do something real, not just to him, but to the practice he embodied. That the authority I had spent 14 years building was sufficient to make documented harm visible and accountable. That is different from revenge. It took me time to understand how it was different. It still requires explanation I'm not always sure I give correctly. What does not resolve, I should tell you, is the specific memory of standing in that hallway at 17 with a failing exam in my hand, and 31 pairs of eyes having just watched me be told I was an example of waste. That memory doesn't improve with distance. It doesn't hurt the same way it hurt at the time, but it doesn't become neutral. It becomes something you carry with a certain precision, the way you carry a tool you know the weight of. There is a student who comes to mind specifically from the first grant cycle. His name was Isaiah Mitchell, which is a name I can share because it's his and not mine to suppress. He was 18, first-generation college student, working overnight shifts at a gas station to pay for his younger siblings' school supplies while their mother underwent treatment. His advisor had written him an evaluation that called him inconsistent and difficult to predict, and his application to a specific program had been denied on those grounds. He came to the foundation through a school counselor who'd heard about us from another counselor. We reviewed his case. We found documentation inconsistencies in how the evaluation had been applied relative to stated policy. Our legal team sent a formal inquiry to the institution. The institution reviewed the inquiry. The decision was reconsidered. Isaiah Mitchell enrolled in the program. I received an email from him the following year. He was doing well. He wanted to express gratitude. I read that email a few times. I thought about what my grandfather would have made of it. A man who had believed completely that practical care for people was the most serious work a person could do. I thought he would have called it useful. The letters are still coming in. Not all of them resolve. Some of the cases we take on hit institutional resistance we can't fully overcome. Some students we help still face consequences we can't reverse. The system is large and slow and built to reproduce its own conditions. We are one foundation with limited staff and finite resources, and the need is larger than we can fully meet. I know this. I file it with the things I know. What I do every morning is get up and run my route and come back and make coffee and sit at my desk and open whatever is in the queue. Applications, compliance reports, board correspondence, legal briefs. The accumulated paperwork of trying to make something work correctly inside a system that was not originally designed with everyone in mind. My grandfather made 2 fried eggs every morning and put them on a plate with toast cut diagonally. He asked me the same question every evening until he couldn't ask it anymore. He held his life together with routine and principle and the specific stubbornness of someone who never believed that what was given to him was the full extent of what was possible. The foundation is named for him. The letterhead reads, the Marcus Adams Foundation. Academic Equity and Emergency Support Initiative. I chose those words carefully, not because they were poetic, because they were accurate. Some mornings I sit at my desk before the emails start arriving, and I am aware, in a way that requires no analysis, that the cold thing is still there, that it will probably always be there, that I have built something real and correct and larger than that cold thing, and that this is the correct relationship to have with it, not to eliminate it, not to be controlled by it, but to have built something that it cannot touch. The coffee is hot. The queue is full. Outside the window, another city day is organizing itself into its ordinary requirements. I open the first file. Stories like this happen more than you think. Someone right now is sitting in silence, building something the people who underestimated them will never see coming. Subscribe. The next story is already waiting.